Well, hello everyone. It is truly a pleasure to introduce everyone on the panel today. I can't tell you how much I've learned from each one of our distinguished panelists. And what is so wonderful about having them here today is that although they come from very different backgrounds and places, and they draw on very different methodologies, I like to think of all of them as exquisite boundary crossers. They're all willing to research difficult topics and then speak very uncomfortable truths at large. In short, their work collectively exposes hidden realities, including those with state and corporate secrets, and they do so to invigorate the democratic processes which are currently under threat due to many different things, but including due to corruption and surveillance. So what's going to happen today is I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then we're going to jump into discussion. So I'm going to start with Trevor Paglen, who is right there, all the way to the right. He is a geographer, an artist, and a writer. And there's a great quote from his webpage, which I'm just going to draw on explicitly, because it really captures the heart and soul of his work. He says his work blurs lines between science, contemporary art, journalism, and other disciplines to construct unfamiliar yet meticulously researched ways to see and interpret the world around us. For over a decade, Paglen has been relentlessly exposing black, shadow, and clandestine government worlds, from military subcultures to disturbing CIA rendition programs of kidnappings. He channels his research into books. He's authored or co-authored an impressive 5 of them. And of course, as an artist, he has numerous projects. His work has been showcased in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Tate Modern, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, among many other places. So next we have Chris Segoyan. Chris Segoyan is the principal technologist and senior policy analyst at the ACLU's Speech Privacy and Technology Project. Between 2009 and 2010, he was the first in-house technologist at the Federal Trade Commission's Division of Privacy and Identity Protection. And one of the interesting things that we are going to talk about is this role of a technologist. It's a very recent kind of category of worker that is really important in fighting for privacy. So when he was at the FTC, he worked on investigations against Facebook, Twitter, MySpace, and Netflix. Prior to joining the FTC, he co-created Do Not Track Privacy Anti-Tracking Mechanism, which is now the standard for all major web browsers. He also has a PhD, which was completed in Indiana University in 2012, and it focused on the role that third-party service providers play in facilitating law enforcement surveillance of their customers. And finally, we have Jillian York. She is currently the Director for International Freedom of Expression at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Her work encompasses a broad range of topics, from digital security to the privatization of censorship, especially in the Arab world. And I, turn to her very routinely for her work on censorship, especially. She really identifies the global, regional, local, corporate, and technological threats against free speech. She has written for many different publications, including Al Jazeera, The Atlantic, The Guardian, Foreign Policy, and CNN. She recently contributed a chapter to the volume Beyond WikiLeaks: Implications for the Future of Communication, Journalism, and Society. So join me in welcoming the panel today. All right, so I'm going to start off with a question, even though I've just spoken for a little bit too long. But I'd like to hear a little bit about a kind of personal or very specific moment when you came to realize that surveillance censorship was particularly important to democracy.
Well, I think we should start out the panel by declining to reveal personal information, right? In the spirit of what we're talking about here. So, I don't like to personalize this, and I don't like to make this about, my personal journey or something like that. So I'm gonna no comment that one.
I think I'm going to do something very similar to Trevor. I'll say that, I've been trying to tell the story of surveillance for 5 or 6 years now, and I think it's a topic that everyone cares about, and everyone sort of suspects the government can do stuff, but they don't really know the details. And when you tell them the details, one, they're really scared, and then two, they want to learn more. And so I think this is something that everyone's interested in, but you have this tension, which is that the government argues that if they have a public conversation about how they're collecting information, how they're tracking people, that will allow the bad guys to avoid the surveillance. And so what that actually ultimately does is it short-circuits the democratic process. We don't get oversight over surveillance. We don't get a public debate. The courts don't know what's going on. Congress doesn't know what's going on because, we want to make sure the bad guys can be surveilled as much as possible. And I personally don't agree with that framing, and so I do everything in my power to make sure that the public learns, the courts learn, Congress learns, but there is this extreme tension over where democracy is on one side and effectiveness of surveillance is on the other.
Okay, I'm game. I'll tell a personal story. I can't remember my awareness about it, but I can remember my first personal encounter with surveillance, and that was about 10 years ago. I was living in another country and learned that I was being followed. And learned that, this is routine. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't anything interesting. I was an English teacher. But as a foreigner in a town with very few foreigners, I would go in for my interview for my visa. I'd only been there for a few months, and it was really strange that the police seemed to know everything about my comings and goings. And I think that was really my first awareness. And I can also add, my first awareness around digital surveillance was sharing an office with you and your work. So thank you for that.
It's infectious, right?
Let me then turn the question around a little bit, because one of the things that happens when I teach students about privacy and surveillance is that they feel it's very distant to them, unlike free speech. Free speech is so much part of the North American imaginary that it's almost physical, right? Whereas privacy is really, many miles away. So what are some tactics to personalize the issue, even though it's very much, not necessarily an issue about individuals, but collectives?
I mean, when I was teaching, one of the exercises that I would have to do was I would look at students' Facebook profiles with them, and I would imagine that I was a credit agency and an insurance company, and go through it and talk about how I would modify their credit rating and their insurance policies based on what I found in their Facebook profiles. And that made it very, very clear to them that, I think that was a way of personalizing it in a way.
So I started at the ACLU in 2012, and I remember my first week on the job, the media team told me that I had to go on Fox News, and I was terrified because my vision of Fox News was Bill O'Reilly, and so I figured I was going to go in and be the punching bag for this shock jock, and it turned out that Fox News loves surveillance and they love anti-surveillance people because there's a Democrat in the White House, and so for the last 2.5 years, I've gone around the country and I've spoken frequently in front of extremely conservative audiences. I've testified at the Texas State House before their House and Senate. I've met with extreme conservatives, and I've also done the same thing for the extreme left as well. And well, the first thing is when you go far enough on the right, you come out the other side. And so both extremes love surveillance. But I have to alter my messaging a little bit. Right, so in a liberal city, I'll talk about, the NSA is collecting records of every domestic telephone call, and there's a program that's hopefully going to expire momentarily. And so in a liberal city, I'll say, within that database is a record of everyone who's called an abortion clinic, and everyone who's called a suicide hotline, and everyone who's called a gay bookstore. And then when I go to a conservative town, I'll say, and within that database is a record of everyone who's called a gun store, and everyone who's visited a church or hasn't visited a church, and everyone who's gone to a pro-life rally. And it turns out that people might be interested in different things, but everyone cares about their privacy. Sometimes you have to put it in the context of the government, and sometimes you put it in the context of employers or professors or teachers or future dates. But I've never found an audience where I wasn't able to connect, where they said, screw it, everything I do is public. There are secret things that we all have, and one of my favorite law professors, Paul Ohm, who's at Georgetown now, talks about this concept of a database of ruin. The idea is that there are databases out there that contain information about all of us, where we are able to function in society because the practical costs of combining that data with other things are too high or have been too high. But there's information out there that could sink us all. It doesn't take very long. Doesn't take very long to start poking at people before they start squirming and getting a little bit uncomfortable, and then you know a little bit about what that data is.
I do most of my work internationally outside of the US. I live in Germany, and one of the things that I've found is just, I mean, this isn't as specific to surveillance, but in terms of privacy, in terms of helping people understand the concepts of privacy and how they shift across cultures, this is a really basic analogy, but I enjoy it a lot. We've got probably mostly Americans in the room, and you know that when you go to a public toilet, the stall door comes to about here. In Europe, it comes to the floor, and I've been places in the world where there's no door at all. And I think that, you know, finding those analogies that speak to people on a level that they completely understand, because everyone uses the toilet, is actually quite helpful.
No, absolutely, and I will say I've seen Chris Sagoyan in action in my classroom, and after his lecture, there were hordes of students who came up to him because he talked about how there's technologies that creepy men can use to hack into people's computer and turn on their webcam without them knowing, and people were horrified. And then next class, about half the students had Band-Aids on their webcams, so very effective. So, you know, we are in this, what seems to be a very exceptional moment when it comes to surveillance, right? It seems so omnipresent, and it hits from so many different quarters, right? The corporate, the government, from kind of high surveillance to micro surveillance. So one of the questions I want to ask the panelists is what is unique about the contemporary moments? Because governments in the last 100 years have basically made surveillance a kind of cornerstone of their political function. So during times of war, for example, in Russia, France, the United States, these countries would hire armies of people to open up mail, right? So what's unique or not about the current moment when it comes to secrecy and surveillance?
I think a lot. I mean, on one hand, you have things like, we have seen the rise of this like network society, network culture, like the expansion of telecommunications companies to telecommunications technologies to every facet of our lives. And that has created an infrastructure that allows surveillance on a scale that's never been seen before. Every router, every USB stick, every fiber optic cable, every phone, every handset, the most intimate parts of our lives are connected to telecommunications infrastructures just on a sense of pure scale on one hand. On the other hand, I think there's this question of storage and efficiency. It simply has not been, you know, you go look at the Stasi archives now and these like buildings full of index cards seem utterly quaint, right? I mean, compared to, you contrast that with like the Utah data center, for example. So that's another question of scale and the ability to store things. That question of storage has a corollary, which is a kind of time travel, you know, in the sense the ability to search across time. And it was kind of interesting. I was talking to a guy named Dan Bernstein recently, a guy who's a cryptographer, and he was talking about a project to try to develop post-quantum computing cryptography. In other words, cryptography that would be hardened against a quantum computer's attack. And I was asking him, like, you know, why are you working on this? These kind of computers are still pretty theoretical. And he was saying, well, we need to have that kind of encryption today because we need to defend against an attacker 20 years in the future because all of the data will be stored. So that's new in a way too. But I think one of the big things that's often overlooked is the kind of political and cultural effect that these kinds of programs have had. You know, for example, if 20 years ago you said, oh, we're gonna, in the future, there will be robots that can assassinate people based on metadata, and every single, you know, telecommunications transaction will be monitored by the state, this would have been obscene. Like, this would be totally out of the question, and you know, you would not find any support for that. Fast forward to living in a world where the US does torture people and does assassinate people and does mass surveil people, and now there's a controversy around it. Well, what's different? What the difference is that it's actually been done. And the difference between that and the past is that I think with the, and this is kind of a critique of this politics of exposure, not a critique of it, but a limitation of it. which is that what we've seen over and over again is through the exposure of these programs. What's different in the past is when these programs were exposed under Nixon and you had the church hearings and that sort of thing, the game was kind of up, and the CIA and the NSA were like, okay, we're busted, we've been breaking the law, and there were some attempts to try to reform. That's a very marked contrast to this kind of post-9/11 world, where the response has been to retroactively legalize programs that were clearly illegal. And the effect that that has had is to kind of legitimize policies and create new laws, often in secret, that basically legalize things that were clearly illegal when they were being done.
Although, can I push back a little bit
Yeah.
before we continue on? I mean, one of the things you were referring to was the Church Commission, which was in response to a massive leak by the Citizens Commission to expose the FBI, which broke into a field office in outside of Philadelphia and exposed COINTELPRO, which is this massive government program of infiltration, where the whole point was to spread disinformation and dismantle, all sorts of political groups and movements, and they did so quite effectively in some ways, right? So, in some ways it's, I don't mean to minimize the current moment, but it does seem that COINTELPRO was really something else, right? And in some ways, on the one hand, I'm like, okay, well, at least that's not happening right now. On the other hand, I'm like, well, we don't know everything that's happening now, right? And the past then makes me think that that's totally possible in the present. So I guess it's more of a comment than anything else, but it does also make me wonder about the human element in surveillance and informants as well.
So I think there are two things I'll say. The first is that the surveillance that took place in the 1960s, the problematic surveillance that Church and his colleagues investigated, the senators could get their heads around it. The lawyers who assisted the committee, the investigative reporters who were working there, they could read the documents, interview people, and understand what was taking place, and then they could have a debate and say, okay, do we want to have the FBI breaking into people's houses and putting in microphones? The meaty questions were ones that everyone could understand. And the surveillance that takes place in 2015 is so technically complex that even the people who are supposed to be doing oversight don't understand what's going on. There have been ample situations where the NSA lawyers who are filing applications at the FISA court, the secret court in this country, the NSA lawyers didn't know what the NSA engineers were doing, and then the FISA court judges didn't know anything about technology, so couldn't ask the right questions. And so you had a situation where the FISA court was authorizing one thing, and the NSA was doing something very different and something much bigger. And it was only when NSA's engineers when the information finally percolated up to the highest levels, they said, oh shit, we're not even obeying the order we've received. And so we have this big problem, which is that, in the last 20 years, NSA shifted from being a signals intelligence agency, an agency that goes around and collects a huge amount of information, to being, one of the biggest components of NSA now is hacking. So NSA is now a hacking organization that is not run by people who understand hacking and is not overseen by people who understand hacking. And they're also a data mining organization, which is something they weren't in the past. And so our oversight system just isn't structured to be able to oversee something this technologically complex. The second point I'll make, the other thing that's sort of really changed, I think, since the 1960s. So Radley Balco, who's a journalist, has written extensively about the militarization of police and how SWAT teams are now in every small community. And I think for many Americans, what happened in Ferguson last year was sort of a wake-up call, because they got to see these armored personnel carriers and these, tanks and other military equipment in their small towns being used by ill-trained local law enforcement. But it's not just the tanks and the AK-47s and the vests that have trickled down to law enforcement. It's also surveillance technology. It's cell phone trackers, biometric devices, license plate readers, all this high-tech surveillance gear that was, the billions of dollars of R&D costs were borne by the defense community. And then once the product sort of kind of worked and then lowered in price, then state and local law enforcement agencies were able to buy these things with grant money. And for all the controversy around Ferguson, and I'm not not downplaying it, but most of the armored personnel carriers, the Bearcats that have been distributed to local communities, they don't get used very often. Like if they pull them out, once a year for the Pumpkin Parade or the 4th of July Parade, as a show of force and say, look at the cool stuff we have. But the surveillance technology, they use every single day. It isn't just like rotting in the backlot of the police department. It's being used every day to target regular Americans. And, it's one thing to use it in a battlefield, but when it comes back home, these technologies are simply not appropriate for domestic use. And so we now have basically every little law enforcement agency being their own intelligence agency using tools and technologies that were created for the NSA and the CIA and JSOC, and I think that's highly problematic.
I have something to add to that too, but Chris, I'm surprised that you didn't say the cost.
Oh, I live in Washington. Money's wasted everywhere. So, yeah, there's a lot of money spent on surveillance, but I'm more concerned about the actual intrusion onto my rights and not the waste of cash.
No, I didn't mean that. I mean the fact that surveillance has gotten cheaper.
Yes, surveillance has gotten much cheaper. People have discussed this extensively, but it used to be that the police would have to, tell you when they followed you around, and that took a lot of resources, and there's only so many officers. And now a single police officer can track 50 or 100 people from the comfort of their desk, without leaving an air-conditioned office. And where the cost of surveillance drops, then agencies do more surveillance. That's also a problem because it means that it's not just that they are capable of doing more intrusive surveillance, they're capable of doing it to more people simultaneously.
I think for me, it's the global nature of it. So you're talking about small communities where you have massive amounts of equipment, and that training often comes from other countries. You have Israeli military training police officers in the United States, for example, and the same goes for other elements of surveillance. You have the NSA sharing information with a number of other countries. You have companies in Germany and Italy selling intrusion software to governments in Bahrain and other parts of the Middle East. And I think that the fact that this threat, follows us around wherever we travel is what really scares me, that you can't hide from it, that it is, in fact, incredibly global. I think that's probably the thing for me.
Well, I think we've just gotten a real taste of how much our three panelists know, and one of the things that makes their work so important is that they're so effective in a lot of ways. But when it comes to the labor of artists, technologists, or activists, it's actually sometimes a little bit hidden. So I want to hear a little bit more about how you do your work in a very nitty-gritty sense, and maybe I'm just indulging my anthropological desires right now. But please, if you can, describe one important project in this area that you have worked in, and in some detail, because I do think it's important to kind of convey the type of work, particular work that you do, and especially some of the challenges you face as you do this work.
So it's just, my process is unbelievably inefficient. Really. For people who are not familiar with my work, what I mostly do is make abstract art that kind of doesn't look like anything. Like it'll be big black print and there'll be like some dot on it, and that's it. But there's an enormous amount of research that goes into that, and we were kind of talking about this last night a little bit. So, for example, I have a project where I track all of the classified American satellites that are in orbit around the Earth, and there's about 300 of these things. And that is done using tools and methods developed for astronomy. So it's basically going out, observing things, writing down what you saw and where, deriving an orbit, so modeling an orbit of a satellite, and then once you've modeled the orbit, you can try to make predictions about it. It's unbelievably inefficient, and what you end up with is, these little dots, for example. Been working on a new project where Süddeutsche Zeitung and some reporters published a list of all the underwater fiber optic cables that the NSA had taps on. And when you look at underwater cables, we can get to this later, you really see what the geography, in a way, of the internet looks like, but also the geography of telecommunications in general, and this kind of geography of surveillance. And one of the things that I'm constantly trying to do is look at things, like go to the place in the world where something is happening. And so a lot of these cables are underwater, and so what I was doing was trying to figure out just where they were. And then I was taking scuba diving lessons, and then kind of trying to plot where they were in GPS coordinates, and then going out in boats and dropping buoys and building these search patterns, and then going underwater with scuba divers and getting these underwater scooters and swimming these search patterns to just find these cables, because I just want to see what does this look like. So that's another example of just, it's very, taking a huge amount of data. So for example, in that project, it's looking at maritime charts, so noted in documents like Google Earth, reef structures, environmental impact reports, and just trying to put together a mosaic of information that should give you a clue as to where to look for these kind of things. So it's just very, very labor-intensive kind of research craft. I mean, it's not theoretical work. It's just very, very like straight up empirical.
I think for me that was a confirmation that the life of an artist is more interesting than the life of a computer scientist.
I'm not a typical artist.
The fact that you get to scuba dive and then write it off your taxes, that's just really amazing.
You want to join?
Yeah, I'd love to. So, the most exciting research method that I use is, I moved to Washington in 2009 when I was doing my PhD because I realized that to study surveillance and to learn how surveillance was taking place, I needed to be near the people who do the surveillance. And so even though all the tech companies are in Silicon Valley, all their surveillance lawyers are in Washington, D.C. And so the method that I use to get most of my stuff is to go out drinking with lobbyists and lawyers and on their expense accounts and get them to tell me the things that are weighing down their soul. And that really just boils down to the fact that their husbands and wives don't care what they do, and they really want to tell someone about their troubles at the office, and I'm really excited to listen. So that's the exciting part of my job, and then the majority of my job is it's really boring. I read thousands of pages of documents and then look for the interesting stuff. And a great example of this, is an unintentional collaboration between me and Jillian's organization, EFF. So her organization filed a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request, to learn about the FBI's use of malware in the late 2000s. They get thousands of pages of documents, they put them online, because EFF is a progressive organization that wants to share stuff with the world. So they put them online, and then no one ever looks at them. And then last year, I read 1,500 pages over the course of 2 days and stumbled across one page revealing that the FBI had impersonated the Associated Press in an effort to deliver malware to a teenager in Seattle in 2007. And had I not read all those pages at my dining table, drinking lots of coffee, we wouldn't have had the debate that we then had, where all the major news organizations in the country wrote to the FBI and said, this is totally outrageous, you cannot be impersonating the press. This was a major controversy. And I didn't have to sneak some documents out of anywhere. They were just sitting on a public webpage of one of our collaborative partners, and just no one had ever taken time to read through all these boring things and then put them in context. And so yeah, I just read everything I can get my hands on, and then I try and decipher it.
But Chris, is another part of what you do as well, which is you're a master manipulator or something like that. I mean, not a manipulator, but you're a master of drawing people out and getting people to expose themselves and shaming companies to doing things that they might not necessarily otherwise do. You're really, really good at getting people to do stuff, by shaming them for the most part.
That's a little bit true. Yeah.
Yeah, I concur. I don't know how to top that. I think, for me, the thing that gets me really excited when I'm doing this work is reaching out to people who might not be aware of it. And most of my work is in the Middle East and North Africa, and a lot of times you get people going well, why? There's so much shit happening in there's so much happening in your country. Why don't you focus closer to home? And I grappled with that for a long time because I do understand that perspective. And mind you, this perspective usually comes from Americans, not people that I'm working with in that region. But when it comes down to it, the governments are cooperating. I was just at this conference a few months ago, the global conference on cyberspace. You might have seen in the news, the police busted into my room while I was sleeping. It was awesome. And at that conference, you had someone from the Chinese government literally say that it was important for police around the world to hold hands and cooperate. And so if the police are doing that, if law enforcement, if governments are doing that, then it's imperative that we as people do that as well. And so working from the principle of solidarity, never taking the voice from someone else, I would say that to give an example of a project so you know what I actually do. One of the projects that I'm the most proud of is about 2 years old. It's a really simple little thing. It's called Digital Citizen, or Muatan Rakami. It's a newsletter that comes out every 2 weeks in 3 different languages. And the amount of people that jump into a document every 2 weeks and put links together and write and translate I think we're from like 15 different countries, gives me so much hope for the world. And it's such a simple little thing. I mean, our goal with this project is to educate people about any issue related to digital rights, so surveillance, privacy, free expression, intellectual property happening in the Middle East. Because there's just not a whole lot of information out there for the public. And so we put this out in French, Arabic, and English every 2 weeks. But it's the heart and the amount of effort from so many different people collaborating and going into that's what keeps me going.
Well, thanks for indulging me. Those were great answers. And so we've learned that scuba diving, drinking, and newsletters, are the important labor, and fearlessness, because they all are. And maybe I'm just going to extend this question about the unique craft of each person, because I came up with a question that really targets directly what each person does. And I might have to read from my notes a little bit in this case. And we're going to start with Jill. And it also just segues so perfectly.
Because it's really hard going after both of them every time.
All right, we're going to move it. All right, so Jill has described herself, and I really like this quote. This is a direct quote, as tri-continental, with my feet in Germany. She lives in Berlin, a piece of my heart in Morocco, and a large part of my soul throughout the Arab world. And, if you follow her on Twitter, this is eminently the case. She travels more than anyone else I know. And, one of the things I've always appreciated about her work, and again, this derives a little bit from the fact that I'm an anthropologist, is that she moves between cultural worlds in these very profound sense. So I want to hear a little bit more about what these experiences of cultural and political contrast, how they feed into her understanding of the politics of surveillance here and abroad as well.
Okay. So I moved to an Arab country and started learning Arabic when I was 22. And the result of that is that my political education, my activist education, and all of it comes from friends in that part of the world. Which means that I'm actually looking into my own country now with a different lens than I would have had I, spent my formative political years here. And I think, that learning is really different than what's often expected. There's often this expectation that people in other parts of the world are learning from us, or us being the West, not necessarily the US. And for me, that just hasn't been the case at all, which is not to say that I don't have incredible role models here too. But I think that, when it comes to this issue in particular, to give an example, I was doing a digital security training, real rookie, a couple years ago, in Palestine. And I was talking to the group, and I was trying to talk about threat modeling and going through, what are your, I was asking questions such as, what are you trying to protect? Who are you trying to protect it from? How much effort are you willing to put into it? And everyone had ready answers. Everyone knew who their threats were. Everyone really kind of understood surveillance inherently, because in that particular case, in the West Bank, you're dealing with not one, not two, but often 3 different threat actors who might, come after you. Possibly more than 3, I don't know, I'm not counting. But in that case, I felt that it was something, when I do digital security trainings in the US amongst journalists, for example, sure, they understand the threat to their sources, but they don't necessarily understand the other implications. Might be truer now than before. But now that I've done these trainings in other parts of the world and with marginalized groups in the US, it's kind of a wake-up call to go, oh, I'm the one who's ignorant here. I'm the one who has so much incredible privilege. And in fact, I think a lot of my learning ends up coming from the communities that I work with.
So now something similar for Chris, and you've touched upon this, but I want you to kind of be a little bit more meta about staff technologists. I mean, I kind of mentioned we were going to talk about this. The staff technologist is a relatively new position. There's probably, a couple of dozen, if that, who work at different NGOs and institutions. And, as part of this line of work, I'm just going to give an example. You help Google into turning on SSL encryption by default. Maybe you can explain what that is. One saying, if I'm 5% responsible for Google turning on SSL, it's the most important thing I've done in my life. So can you tell the audience a little bit more about the importance of staff technologists and the difference they've made, and what else we need to do to kind of proliferate this position in different organizations?
Yeah, so it used to be that technology was this really small area of our society. And so if you were ignorant about technology, it meant that your VCR would flash 12 o'clock, and you would refuse to interact with computers as much as you possibly could. But that would be this one area of your life, and you just sort of leave it alone, and then you'd move on with the rest of your life. And now technology affects everything. And so technological illiteracy means that people really are unable to function or unable to make wise choices in many, many areas of their lives. And I live in Washington because that's where the policy making happens, and so most policymakers don't understand technology either. And so that doesn't just mean we get bad policy in the area of technology, it means we get bad policy in every area. And so that's a really big problem, because the underlying issues are not technical issues. There's like this thin technical layer around an economic or equality related issue, but if people cannot wrap their heads around the technology, then they don't get to the important thing. And so I see my role as being the translator to help people get past that thin layer of technology to then get to the point where they can have a conversation and debate and discuss these more important issues. And the unfortunate thing is computer science programs don't do a very good job of producing people who have empathy or communication skills. Programmers are taught to communicate with other programmers, and they use buzzwords, they use deep lingo, and they're used to winning arguments by just saying enough things the other person doesn't understand until the other person gives up. And that's no way to be. That kind of approach essentially means that technical people get left out of the conversation, because no one likes to be made to feel stupid. And we have a lot of problems in our government because policymakers don't understand technology. And so, I'm the first technologist that ACLU has hired. I was the first technologist the Federal Trade Commission had hired. Now the FTC has a chief technologist and a team of technologists, and the ACLU has two, and EFF and CDT and all the other sort of tech civil liberties groups all have people like me. Some do more hands-on tech stuff. I try to avoid touching technology as much as I possibly can, because I really feel like the best use of my time is talking to lawyers and talking to reporters. I read every brief we file in our law enforcement surveillance cases, and I make sure that what we're saying is accurate. I propose arguments based on my understanding of the technology, and we're able to do things that we wouldn't be able to do without an understanding of this stuff. And having technical people working with the policy people really changes how an organization does work. I'll also say that I spend probably half my time every week talking to reporters on the phone. And most of the time, I don't get a quote in the story. I'm just explaining stuff to them. I get pulled up to Capitol Hill to go talk to members of Congress and their staff. Again, they don't care what I think. They just want me to explain how stuff works. And so there's this desperate need, both in the media and in academia, in policymaking circles, in regulatory circles, in the judiciary. Everyone needs to understand technology. And there are so few people who have this skill, and it's not like I have some kind of magic skill. It's just universities aren't intentionally putting people out with these skills yet. And my hope is that in the next few years we will see this as a specific, career path. Right now it isn't a career path. Everyone who does this has sort of fallen into it.
No, it's a good reminder that I think some of us actually are well positioned to try to push computer science departments in this country to allow for that type of work, because you're absolutely right. There's very few programs in the country where you can do that. Berkeley, you can maybe do it in Princeton because of Ed Felton, but very few places. And if we kind of create a space in those departments, we'll see that category of person kind of proliferate. Well, you talked about reporters and journalism, and journalists have been incredibly important in terms of transmitting the news of surveillance, and we'll get to that. But I have my final question, very specific question to Trevor, which is slightly different than what I've been asking, but it does have to do with changes in journalism. So as I already mentioned your work welds very tightly together social science and geography with a range of art practices, from visualizations to photography. And one of the recent changes that we've seen with journalism is that they've really turned to kind of visualization as a way to kind of portray data. And they don't kind of entirely overturn journalistic conventions, but nevertheless, they are kind of experimenting with new modalities of story structure. So my question is, how do techniques like these new forms of visualization that journalists are using that relate to artistic strategies, do you think that they're capable of reaching broader audiences? Are they being effective? And then maybe you can talk a little bit as well about reaching audiences through museums as well, which is something that we talked about before the panel.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the way that all of us understand the world is like we have vocabularies, and one of the vocabularies that we have is like English, for example, but we have many, many other kinds of vocabularies, and one of the vocabularies that we use to make sense of the world is images and representations. And we live in a highly, highly visual culture, right? And so I do think that image making is a way of just, again, it's almost like generating words in a language that you can use to understand the world around you. And for me, that's been a very, very important project, particularly when we're looking at things like, NSA cyber warfare systems or something like that, because there are just, if you just go by the Snowden documents, like mass surveillance looks like PowerPoint, And so it's like trying to generate other, reference points, that we can use for that. I would say though, if we talk about image making as the creation of this vocabularies, and you have visualization kind of at one end of it, and on the other hand you have abstract art, which, I would definitely put myself much further on the abstract art side than the visualization side. Because although I do work that's very research intensive and very, very empirical, I'm actually not interested in making something that explains something to you. I'm interested in making something that tries to put something on a cultural agenda and then creates an opportunity for other people to think about it for themselves. So I'm always nervous about images that are very self-assured, images that kind of believe in their own explanatory power, because I think images are deeply weird things that we really can't control, that run away from us, as quickly as we try to understand them. And I think that's what's powerful about images, actually, and what's powerful about art making is that actually working with the irrational, working with the indeterministic, working with materials that will run away from you, that you can't nail down. And I think that's actually really, really an important thing to have in society, particularly as we're moving towards a culture where everything has to be quantified, everything has to be rationalized. I really do hold out that avant-gardist kind of insistence on the refusal to speak sensibly in a certain way. I think that can actually be a very powerful political position as well as an aesthetic one. Having said that, another kind of part of the work that I do is not just image making, but trying to creative institution building or creative architecture or things like that, where I'm looking at what are the social relations and economic relations through which different things are produced in the world, and how could we create things that have different social and cultural relations embedded within them. I'm thinking the project that's kind of getting out in the world more nowadays is a project with Jake Applebaum, who's one of the developers in the Tor project, and what we've been doing is building sculptures that sit in museums, but they're connected to basically museums usually have really, really fast internet connections, and what we're doing is basically the museum's internet connection goes into the sculpture, and the sculpture it does a couple of things. First, it's just a minimalist looking sculpture, but it creates free Wi-Fi throughout the museum, but it routes all of that traffic over Tor, so it anonymizes all the traffic that's going through it. But the other thing that it does is that it itself is a Tor relay, so it allows people from all over the world to anonymize their own traffic by using this sculpture in a museum and by using the museum's bandwidth to do that. And so for me, that is a project where it's thinking about, if we start from the premise that museums are civic institutions, which is a premise that I think can debate the extent to which they actually are, but I think that's the goal and that's the philosophy. Like museums should be like libraries and serve the public good. It's thinking about taking actually the nuts and bolts and cables that the institution is made out of and trying to correct them or a little bit, or make those nuts and bolts or make those infrastructures more civic, make it more of a part of a more civic kind of internet, for example.
Great. Well, now I'm going to talk a little bit about controversies, and this is inspired directly from Jillian York. If you follow especially Chris and Jill on Twitter, well, first of all, everyone's line of work courts controversy. But I would say Chris and Jill in particular also are often, arguing in very passionate ways on Twitter, in conferences, and they're really, not afraid to speak their mind. So again, inspired by Jill, what's the most controversial, idea you hold related to this area and why?
Okay. I would like to live in a society where surveillance is not possible. I should have gone first. Sorry. I think that surveillance undermines democracies. I think that surveillance corrodes democracies, and that whatever we get out, whatever utility, whatever positive things you get by being able to monitor the communications of really bad people are outweighed by the totally destructive effect that surveillance has on a democracy.
So no government should have no ability to surveil.
I think that governments are going to try and surveil, but I would like to live in a society where surveillance is not technologically possible.
Okay, so that wasn't mine exactly, luckily.
Okay.
So this is controversial as well, and I want to clarify I'm speaking only for myself here, because I think that...
oh yeah, by the way, that was also just me. That was not an official ACLU statement there.
Yeah, same. This is not an officially EFF statement. There's the division that's made right now is between mass surveillance and targeted surveillance, and most organizations doing this work come very clear on the line that mass surveillance is never acceptable. But a lot will say that targeted surveillance in some cases under certain provision, blah, 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 is. And that's a fine view if that's the perspective you're coming from, but my personal, can't reiterate that enough, view on this is that I want to live in a world without surveillance. Any surveillance.
I guess mine is a little bit different because I wouldn't say it's controversial because it's just not even a question. I think my answer would be, I think that we should shut down all prisons, right? We should just get rid of prisons entirely. And, it's kind of a prison abolitionist statement. And I guess the kind of logic behind that is that when we're talking about contemporary prisons in the United States in the 21st century, we're not talking about the panopticon for the 19th century. We're not, the idea of, someone be reformed and that's just gone. And what we have instead is a system of mass incarceration and a system that's really began in the late 1960s and was constructed over the 1980s and 1990s. And the U.S. over the last few decades has come to incarcerate more people than any other country in the world, and at a higher rate than any other country in the world. And this is really there's a kind of racist foundation to this, which this entire structure was sort of created as revenge for the civil rights movement. And it was deliberately created by Nixon, in the late 1960s, who kind of set the ideological foundation for it with his so-called Southern strategy, which was a way of appealing to American racism as a way to accrue political power. And he was very blunt about this. On his Southern strategy, he would write letters to Eisenhower saying, I found great response to this law and order theme, even in places like New Hampshire, where there is virtually no race problem and relatively little crime. And so it was this kind of coded racism that I think is very much at the foundation of contemporary US culture. And the other kind of part of that is that I think that mass incarceration of Americans kind of created the political backdrop that enabled this war on terror business to get going. And this is when I started looking at the war on terror and looking at CIA renditions, and I did a big project about CIA black sites. And to me, it was not actually surprising, because I thought, well, we already have these prisons Guantanamo Bay is not surprising because it's just a more amped up version of a prison called Pelican Bay in California, which was a supermax prison that was created in the 1980s. And at that time, people just couldn't wrap their heads around it. But would just see the same kind of, it's kind of like a racist neocolonialism that is at the heart of what I think the prison industrial complex, as well as the war on terror. And I think there's a lot of homologies between, even if we start looking at military technologies like being used in criminal justice and that sort of thing. And I see a lot of homologies between drone assassinations and police assassinations, extrajudicial killing, Chicago PD having black sites, so these kind of things. And I think what imagining an end to mass incarceration, asks us to imagine a society that's organized around very, very different principles, right? And I think it's kind of an amazing exercise. And when I was doing prison abolitionist work, we would have meetings where we said, okay, we're shutting down all the prisons tomorrow, and you get $40,000 for every person that you get out of prison. And people very quickly start to imagine very, very different worlds that I think would be much more just and much more equitable.
I just wanted on the record that I agree with that.
Yeah, that was
Can I add something to what Trevor said? So this has been something that's been on my mind a lot recently. There's a growing debate, not really a debate, there's a growing proposal from national security leaders, so the FBI director, the Attorney General, and others calling on Congress to pass legislation that would empower the government to force technology companies like Google and Apple to weaken the security of their products, because tech companies in recent years have built encryption into their products. That means that it's now very difficult, if not outright impossible, for the government to wiretap people's encrypted text messages or encrypted FaceTime chats. And so there's been a conversation about this, and the government says we really, really need this, and there shouldn't be any method of communication that's off limits to us. And the debate that's unfolded has been either in the context of privacy and civil liberties, or in the context of cybersecurity and data security. And it's actually another angle that really, I think, builds on what Trevor's saying, which is one of racism and equality. And the issue boils down to this. Apple has built strong encryption into the iPhone. If you send a text message, if you have an iPhone and you send text messages to someone else who has an iPhone, they're encrypted in a really strong way that makes it very difficult for the government to access them. If you have a FaceTime chat, which is the built-in video and voice conferencing service in iOS, it's encrypted with a method of encryption that even Apple doesn't have access to the underlying information. Again, it's going to be very, very difficult for the government to get at that. In contrast, the text message system built into Android is not encrypted, and the video and voice chatting system built into Android is also not encrypted. Now, there'd be a problem in the market if these were two companies that were selling products at the same prices, except for the fact that iOS and Apple products are a luxury good that are predominantly bought by people, of means. These are products that are bought by wealthy people, and Android phones are sold at much lower price points and are more frequently used by minorities and the poor. And so we end up with a situation right now, today, where someone who has money, who walks into an Apple store and doesn't care about privacy or security or surveillance, walks out of the store with a phone that's extremely difficult for the police to monitor. And a low-income American who walks into Best Buy and buys the lowest price, cheapest smartphone can be easily wiretapped. And I think that's really fucked up, that the poor get screwed yet again in this area of surveillance. And so I hope that over the next weeks and months, we will see a racial justice angle grow in this debate over encryption and surveillance.
Well, those comments and answered just triggered a whole bunch of thoughts and comments. And it's, an excellent reminder that something like surveillance, which we can speak about in its own terms, is really, first of all, part of a very totalizing system. And there's real economics behind it in many different angles. And so maybe extending that a little bit, and I could do so in various ways. I'm going to maybe pose two questions that are not really related, except that they have to do with this economic question, and you can, answer one, both, either one. But one has to do with espionage and surveillance. And it seems to be that, one of the reasons, and you've talked about this, Chris, that there's so much surveillance in the world has to do with economic espionage. But it seems to be that part of the, at least journalistic press discussion hasn't emphasized this. And I want to know why, and what can we do to put that on the table, right? Because that's certainly part of the conversation. And then the second one has to do with corporations and their role. And you've already started to answer this with the Apple example. And obviously not all corporations are positioned equally, and AT&T is very different from an Apple, is very different from a Google. But can we rely on them for solutions when it comes to surveillance?
So many governments do economic espionage, but many governments describe it differently. So the US takes this like moral high horse position, says, shame on China. China is stealing all of our corporate secrets. We don't do that. And then it turns out that the US does sort of do it. They just do it in a slightly different way, but they say, oh, that's a very different thing. So basically, the Chinese will steal information from US companies and give it to Chinese companies and allow the Chinese companies to skip years of R&D and then release products with those features. And the Americans will hack into Chinese companies to know what the Chinese are working on, so that way they can figure out, if there are national security implications for that kind of stuff. So the US wants to know, the US definitely breaks into the networks of foreign companies, but they don't steal it and give it to US companies, they steal it and keep it for themselves. They want it for awareness, they want it so that the next time they're negotiating a treaty, they can get better terms because they know the other party's parameters. But the US totally steals stuff from companies around the world. One of the most sort of interesting and troubling things that I've learned in the last 2 years because of the Snowden cache is, when these documents were first published, our national security officials defended the surveillance and said, no, we have to catch the terrorists. There are really bad guys out there. We want to know what Vladimir Putin's doing. The world is a really dangerous place, da-da-da-da-da. And then when you start to read the articles, it turns out that a huge amount of surveillance is just so that the Department of Trade can have a leg up when they're negotiating the next treaty over timber import duties. And so not only are we doing a huge amount of surveillance for things that do not involve ticking bombs or weapons of mass destruction or anything remotely dangerous, you also have the surveillance that is done in aid of surveillance. And so the two most interesting examples are the UK, which is a close partner of the NSA, hacking into the networks of Belgacom, Belgium's largest phone company, and then the UK also hacking into Gemalto, which is a Dutch-French company that manufactures SIM cards, which are the chips in every phone. And so to get into these companies and to steal these secrets they needed, in the case of Belgacom, they wanted to be able to spy on Belgacom's customers, and in the case of Gemalto, they wanted to be able to spy on cell phones in countries where these SIM cards are being used. They had to systematically stalk the engineers of these companies. Right? And when we talk about collateral damage and surveillance, it's like we think about, they drop a bomb from a drone, and the person lives a street away, and the bomb drifts a little bit and says, people die in war. It's like, shit happens. Or we're looking for emails about this topic, and this person emailed the wrong person, so we overcollected, and we weren't intending to do that. This wasn't like incidental overcollection. This was a multi-billion-dollar intelligence agency with extreme, ruthless powers, turning their lens to law-abiding, innocent engineers who have, husbands and wives, and they pay their taxes, and their kids are at home, and they come home in the evening and kiss their wives or husbands and put the kids to bed. These are decent, honest people who are targeted by intelligence agencies because the credentials they have are useful and might allow the government to then hack into a computer that will then maybe be used by a bad guy at some point down the road. And that is personally really offensive to me, probably because I am one of those engineers. And I could totally see myself, 5 years ago being a target because I worked on a system that someone might want access to. But I think that kind of surveillance and hacking in aid of other surveillance, you cannot defend it when it becomes public, because these are people who've done nothing wrong. And the president last year gave a very public speech about the NSA, and he said, to the people of the world, if you're not doing anything wrong, we're not reading your emails. And it turns out it's not just if you're not doing anything wrong, it's if you're not doing anything interesting, if you don't work anywhere interesting, if you don't have anything that might make our job a little bit easier, we're not reading your email.
So why, though, is the espionage question not one that, is prevalent as a framing device?
Because it's boring. I think really it boils, no one wants to talk about tax treaties for oil and timber and cloth, but there's a lot of surveillance. I mean, there was surveillance done at climate change, Gang of 8 meetings or other multinational, multi-governmental meetings. I think the surveillance stuff is really boring, and there have been so many stories, and it's tough for everyone to keep up. But the main point I want people to take away from this is most of what the NSA does is not about terrorism. It's not about getting access to Vladimir Putin's computers. It's about maintaining this global network of surveillance probes that they can then use for anything later. Right? It's about maintaining access that can then be used for whatever people in any agency that can task the NSA can say, okay, we need to learn about this right now, go and get it. And they have the system in place ready to go, and a huge amount of their resources go into that.
Jill, do you have anything to say about the role of corporations in, being responsible parties for dealing with the surveillance problem? Because I know this is an area you've worked in.
Yeah, I think that this is tricky. Most of the work that I do with corporations has to do more on the speech side of things. But to give an example, I think that there have been positive roles. Chris talked about Google and SSL. I feel like I played a tiny, tiny role in the same deal with Facebook a few years ago. So Facebook did not have encryption by default, and as a result, the Tunisian government, pre-2011, found a way to use it and entrap people into logging into a fake Facebook page. The government then would take their information, erase their contacts, post pro-government things, or arrest them. And as a result, Facebook finally, after many years, got their act together and implemented encryption by default, SSL by default, across the platform. Of course, they still haven't gotten that together on their new venture, internet.org, but hopefully. And so, okay, in that case, this is something where, I think I mentioned threat models earlier, and I don't want to get into that too much, but essentially, when you're talking about, what kinds of tools, what kinds of steps someone should take, sure, I think most of us would kind of push for some of the most, I don't want to say extreme, but some of the harder encryption. But at the same time, when you think about all of the people around the world, your family, your parents, your grandparents, whomever, it's not necessarily realistic to ask them to adopt certain things. And so I think it is really important, and we do have to commend companies when they do take a step like that, that impacts the people, the 10 million citizens of Tunisia. At the same time, could they be doing a lot more? Yes, absolutely. But back to the threat model thing, just so I follow that through completely. And what that means is that if you are in that particular country, if you're in Tunisia and you feel pretty confident that, let's say, the NSA is not sharing information with your government, although who knows, in a case like that, then you would consider Google or a company like Facebook that has their servers not in your country to be a pretty safe bet, with the level of encryption that they're using. And so I think that in that sense, we do need to kind of pat companies on the back when they do the right thing and notice that they do play a role in keeping the millions of people who are not going to adopt strong encryption safe.
And the companies can be helpful. They can be temporary allies. But at the end of the day, they have their own incentives. They are answerable to their shareholders. And so, civil society groups build temporary alliances with companies all the time, and then we get screwed by them all the time. And it's like that story about, was it the crocodile and the frog or something? Anyway, it's their nature to double cross us and screw us, and we get screwed by them all the time. And so, we
get told we're shills for the companies.
Yeah, so I'm happy for the companies to do things to protect our privacy and security, and we say good things about them when they do the good things, and we say bad things about them when we want them to do the good things. But just because they move in the right direction doesn't mean they can't turn around right afterwards. And the unfortunate thing in the area of surveillance is they can publicly announce they're going to encrypt, and then they can get a secret order to not encrypt afterwards, and will never be told about it. And so, I don't want to divert this and talk about the importance of open source software, but when you're relying on a company to provide you with technology and you don't have control of it yourself, and they can update your code remotely and they can push stuff to your devices, you're really relying on them for a lot of things, and ultimately you're not going to know if they get that secret order, and that is definitely one of the things that really worries me right now, is that Google or Apple or Facebook or Twitter or one of these companies is going to get a secret order that forces them to deliver malware to one of their customers, and they're just going to have to go along with it. And we'll say really nice things about them up until the moment they do that, and then We'll be right back to where we were before.
If I can just add one quick thing to that, I mean, I think that there is precedent here. When you look at the way that these companies deal with speech, it can be a good lesson on surveillance. A lot of these companies are semi-secretly handing information or taking down content at the behest of governments. Sometimes it's just a secret phone call from could be our government, could be another one. And so if you look at their behavior in terms of censorship, I think it's very prescriptive in terms of what they may or may not be doing when it comes to surveillance.
Well, it looks like we are running out of time. So basically, to just finish up, I would like each panelist to just leave us with a very, very, very brief statement about the importance of privacy. I know you've already kind of gestured at it, but I think that this is a good way to end, and so I'll just leave it there.
Well, I guess on the topic of privacy, I actually think that there's a lot more at stake here than the concept of privacy, but when I hear people say, well, I don't care about mass surveillance because I have nothing to hide, it's kind of like saying, well, I don't care about freedom of speech because I have nothing to say. And it's really an analogous kind of thing. But I think for me, the bigger kind of question is like the norms around privacy can change. They have changed historically. I mean, that's kind of a cultural thing. But the part of that concerns me is state power, right? And for me, like tools like mass surveillance create such an imbalance and are able to reinforce such asymmetrical power structures within democratic societies that I think that they put the idea of democracy itself in strong jeopardy. When we're looking towards a future that is going to be characterized by extreme income inequality, is going to be characterized by extreme environmental crises, and you add the state power of mass surveillance and extra-legal coercion to that, I think you have the recipe for a very, very, very horrible future.
And I would just say that I think in the next 5 years, we're going to see hacking as a tool trickle down more from federal law enforcement to state and local law enforcement. I'm just waiting for journalists to reveal that the NYPD has purchased hacking software. It's going to happen one of these days. And the idea that local cops are going to have the ability to remotely activate your webcam and your microphone and your computer, it should terrify, I think, everyone in this room. And if you're not worried about the police, you should at least be worried about the fact that stalkers and criminals can also buy and deliver software to you that will remotely activate your webcam. And so if you only do one thing after this session, please get a Post-it note or a sticker and put it over the lens of your webcam. It's the easiest thing you can do to measurably increase your privacy. And then when you want to have that Skype chat with your friends, you take the sticker off. But the camera in your computer should only be used against you with your consent, and by putting something over the lens, you are able to assert control over that process. It's not easy to do something about the microphone, but there are certain things that a camera can capture that a microphone won't.
Yeah, I recommend a Band-Aid for that. Works really well. For me, I think I would say I'm going to take the nothing to hide argument and say, first off, if you say you have nothing to hide, I'm going to call bullshit on you, because do you know every single law in the books, and do you trust the state to not go beyond the law? And then the second bit of that is, if you have nothing to hide, great. Why don't you stop being selfish for a minute and consider all of the people in this country who have been targets, all the people around the world who have been targets, and consider for just a moment that you might have privilege that they don't. So that's what I would say.
Well, that's a great way to end, so please join me in thanking our panelists today.